Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Urban Green Live. I'm your host, John Mandyke, the CEO of Urban Green, coming to you live from Studio Urban Green at our office in Lower Manhattan. This is a program series where I'll be interviewing global experts to better understand how we get to a zero carbon future. And you get to participate too, because we'll have live audience Q&A in just a moment. So I'm really excited for this morning's discussion because it's a topic on a lot of people's minds. Today, we're going to take a look at rebooting energy efficiency policy at the federal level and just what might be in store for buildings coming from new White House and congressional policies. So we're taking the program to Washington, D.C. to hear from one of the nation's leading experts and leading advocates for energy efficiency. I'm excited to welcome the Executive Director of ACEEE, the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, Steve Nadel. Welcome to Urban Green Live.
Okay, thank you. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
That's great. Okay, Steve, before we get into the substance of the issues today, and I know there's a lot, let's talk about process for just a quick minute. Can you help explain for our audience the role ACEEE plays in helping to set federal policy? Like, how do you go about doing it? What do you work on?
Okay, so we're a nonprofit 501c3 organization. We do a lot of research and education work. So we produce about 30 reports a year, and many of them are very oriented toward policy. What does the facts on the ground show about past programs and therefore recommendations going forward? Based on this research foundation, we then work with federal agencies and congressional offices. Often they will contact us because they've heard about our work, but yes, we will also contact them when we think we have something particularly useful and important. So we have those dialogues with the agencies, with the White House, with the congressional offices, and hopefully some of the things that we like to suggest ultimately make it into enacted programs and policies.
Yeah, and you guys have been around for a long time, right? Like, how long is your history?
This is last year we celebrated our 40th anniversary.
Wow, congratulations.
Yeah, we were formed in the Reagan administration.
Excellent. So I don't know about you, Steve, but out of the many jaw-dropping moments from the presidential debate last fall, the biggest for me was when the candidates actually started debating building retrofits. I mean, wow, we've come a really, really long way. So debates are past us. We have a new president. We have a new Congress. How do you see the federal government influencing energy use in buildings?
I see the federal government really gearing up to do a lot. I mean, the president has followed up his debate performance with some, I'll say, promising initial steps. Obviously a lot still to be determined, but we're already hearing that the White House is preparing a major Paris Treaty commitment and plan to be unveiled on Earth Day, and they're actively working on that. The agencies are trying to figure out what they want to do, whether it's DOE, EPA, HUD, et cetera, although they are probably lagging a little bit. And then Congress is really gearing up. They did one bill, a little over a week ago, only minor things for efficiency, mainly having to do with schools. But going forward, there's a lot of bills being prepared, and there's likely to be some significant spending on various different programs for residential, commercial, and industrial. So we see a lot potentially happening, but everybody from the president on down still doesn't quite know how it's going to evolve.
So is there any particular federal policy or approach that you see moving first? I mean, are some things ahead of the line?
Well, we already have appropriated money for schools. So the schools are getting a lot of money, and that could be for all sorts of things, for personal protective equipment and training and whatnot. But one of the specific enumerated uses is to improve ventilation and indoor air quality. So yes, each of the schools is going to have to figure out where that fits into priority. Usually, I mean, some of it could be just retro commissioning and they can do relatively quickly. They have the systems and just need to improve them. but they can use it for capital improvements, but that will take a little bit longer.
So there's a kind of a raging mini debate going on. Can the federal government actually regulate buildings? I mean, what is the federal role with buildings?
Primarily, the federal role is to encourage and assist states and localities. Obviously, the federal government can do a lot with its own buildings, ones it owns or even ones it's rented. But beyond that, it's primarily they provide funding, they provide advice. We can get into the details, there are model building codes, et cetera. Some people think maybe the federal government could actually regulate buildings, do a building performance standard. Others disagree. But as a practical matter, I do not see 60 votes in the Senate to enact federal building standards, even if the Constitution potentially could authorize it, although that's very debatable.
So what do you think then, given that those parameters, what is the most effective role for the federal government to influence buildings?
I think it's going to be technical assistance, research, but also significant funding. But the Department of Energy is drafting, developing all sorts of things that they could help states and particularly cities to do as they're trying to get started. They have the labs, they have their own staff. They, EPA, just for example, came out with a whole package toolkit for building performance standards. And yes, New York City is ahead, but for smaller places, this could be very helpful. There's those types of things. To the extent there's research that's needed, such as in lower cost ways to do building retrofits, I expect significantly increased funding. Likewise, electrification, I'm hearing a lot of interest in the agencies. Again, it would be research. Then ultimately, I think Congress can appropriate money. Yesterday's paper talked about how Biden is eyeing something on the order of $3 trillion, of which energy efficiency in buildings would only be a small portion. But I'm hearing proposals, north of $100 billion for different aspects of buildings. Time will tell what happens. I'm not necessarily saying there'll be hundreds of billions of dollars, but I think there definitely will be at least two-digit billions, if not three. And
do you think that those flow in the form of tax credits or incentives, or how would a building owner benefit from that?
The details are very unclear at this point. For commercial buildings, my best guess is it will be tax incentives. It will be reforms to the 179D tax incentives that are now there. There's a deduction for investments in energy efficiency. Currently, it's 50% beyond the ash rate code, but there's talk about having a lower threshold and using each building as its own baseline. Can you reduce the energy use, call it 25% compared to current use, as opposed to 50% below this ash rate code? So that is most likely. For homes, there are some discussions about incentives, direct incentives, rebates via state energy offices.
So do you see, what's the role for appliances then? And I'm talking, we call them appliances, but in buildings, these could be chillers, they could be very large mechanical systems. Do you see accelerated depreciation in that type of package to try to encourage the change out to more efficient systems?
That's certainly in play. There's some bills, the Real Estate Roundtable and others have been pursuing on accelerated depreciation. There's also the possibility, I know we're working on one potential bill to provide incentives to manufacturers for high efficiency heat pumps. And that ranges from, ductless mini splits that might be used in homes to large, chiller heat pumps that might be used in a very large commercial building.
So tell us about appliance efficiency standards. So I know IECC works a lot on that. What do you see coming down the road next that will impact buildings? And in the context of New York, we don't really, our homes are our multifamily buildings, and so we're talking about large structures. But what can we expect on the appliance efficiency agenda?
Well, for the last 4 years, essentially no new efficiency standards move forward. Yes, there is some old Obama ones that the courts required the Trump people to issue because it was all completed, but nothing has happened. So there's nearly 30 rulemakings that are behind schedule and about 50 rulemakings scheduled to be completed in the next 4 years. So it'll be very active. In terms of buildings, high up on the list are things like residential furnaces. There is commercial boilers will probably come up. There are some of them, but it's probably more at the residential end than commercial. But you do have the boilers, commercial furnaces at some point will come up. Chillers are not federally regulated. They're subject to state building codes. There's some fan efficiency standards that could come into play. So there are some possibilities there, but it's more residential than commercial.
And then what's your outlook for the model codes? I know there's been a lot going on lately in that arena, but what's your view of where they are and where they could go?
Well, at this point, starting with the federal, we're waiting for DOE to have a determination that the 2019 ASHRAE and the 2021 IECC will save significant energy and therefore trigger state reviews. I think that's likely to happen this week. But I know ASHRAE is very much working on the next set of standards. They're trying to move to, their target is zero energy ready performance by, about 2030. The IECC is just starting a new process to be a quote formal standard. And that's going to very much depend on who is on those committees. They've moved away from the members determine. The members will have a few seats, but many other seats. They're just starting to solicit members for that. And it's very unclear what direction that's going to go.
So, I'd love your view on the ideal formula here, if one exists, between the role of appliance efficiency standards, kind of writ large, the role of codes, and then the role of policy for the grid. I mean, these three things are related, but they seem to be developing on separate tracks. Should they be coordinated? Will they be coordinated? I mean, how do you see one influencing the other?
They should be coordinated. They should influence each other. And I'd add a fourth area. It's not just policies for the grid, but the federal government is going to be a major investor through infrastructure. They should also coordinate with them. But appliance standards set minimum floors. Those tend to be levels of efficiency that have been demonstrated in practice in products. Utility and grid programs goes beyond that, but they can help develop the market for the more efficient products that seat the minimums, and therefore help lay the groundwork to get everybody, the manufacturers producing them, the contractors used to installing them, so they can become future standards. And then building codes are particularly for new construction. They help make sure that new buildings are built well and are much less likely to need retrofits, but the codes also apply to large renovations, more than 50% of the floor area is affected. At some point, so those are those three, but then if the federal government comes in, I think helping with retrofits is going to be key, because the standards just do individual pieces of equipment. The codes, by and large, don't deal with a lot of existing buildings, except for when they go major renovation. And that's where the federal government can come in much more with helping to fund additional retrofits, helping to make possible things like building performance standards, which are fine as a regulation, but not everybody can afford the upgrades, and we need some type of assistance to help those who can afford those upgrades to make those upgrades for building performance standards to really work.
I'm going to spend a couple minutes on net zero. It's certainly such a hot topic today. maybe just start generally on, how would you advise people to think about net zero? And what would you recommend as ways to get there?
I think if you are building a new building or undergoing a major renovation, you should target achieving net zero. In order to achieve net zero, you really have to design it from the beginning. I was involved in one project and they already had, working drawings, and someone said, well, can we make it net zero? And, much too late. You have to design it almost from the get-go, but really try to make all these new and major renovation projects net zero. You may not be always able to do it, but if you do it at the conceptual design stage, follow through creative ideas, you often can. So I see that as the approach. Existing buildings, that's going to be tougher. Some of them as part of major renovations, but I'm not sure how many existing buildings will really get to net zero. But let's start building them right the first time. And then, even if existing buildings don't quite get there.
Yeah, I've been reading a lot. There's, I guess, a lot of questions coming down the road on the proportion of net versus the proportion of zero. And I read one article. It was a great quote. It's not my quote, but I loved it. It said, we need less net and more zero, because we see a lot of people or organizations is buying offsets to try to do that. Yeah. So do you see, and concurrent with that, we see the Biden administration adding folks to the SEC who are looking at these things. Do you see regulations coming down the road, or at least standards about, okay, how much is zero, how much is net, and what's the right proportion?
I mean, DOE and the Obama administration did promulgate a definition of net zero. I suspect it's time for some revisions, but I would guess it'd be more at DOE than the SEC, but that's just a guess as opposed to anybody really focusing. The other thing I'd argue is whether you are net zero or not, getting to zero ready, very high efficiency is extremely important, because you're not going to get to zero unless it's highly efficient. Most buildings just don't have that space to put enough panels on to power an inefficient building. Right. Also, as we electrify, and I think we will be, I'm concerned about the peak winter demand. And the more efficient we make those buildings, the less of a winter demand problem we will have. And that's, I think, going to be very important.
Right. So I'll remind our audience, I see questions coming in. We'll get to them in a few minutes, but please post them in the Q&A. So the second part of net zero, Steve, here is the Paris Climate Agreement, right? Because that's essentially where it's asking countries to go. To get to the 1.5 degree C limitation on temperature rise, it's really talking about net zero. Are there early signs about, you hinted at it earlier, about where you think the Biden administration is going to go when it comes to complying with Paris and their national commitment that they're going to have to file soon?
Not too much yet. I know I've been told they have long lists of options. I've seen articles saying, agencies are forwarding them suggestions and they're getting told, what more can you do, and sharpening the pencil. So they are trying to assemble something. When the Obama administration assembled their package, which led to a 26 to 28% target for 2025, there was a lot of back and forth, but ultimately there was a whole set of policies and analysis behind that. I think we'll have the same this time. I've read that the package will assume that Congress does appropriate some significant money, but in terms of details, we don't have a lot yet.
Yeah, if I recall, the Obama plan had kind of three big pillars. It was clean power plant rule, automobile efficiency standards, and of course, then the whole slew of energy efficiency incentives and standards. So do you think at least those three are in play?
I think definitely there'll be something in the power sector. They want to go to, carbon-free by 2025. That's going to be ambitious. Which way they do it, unclear. With the Supreme Court, it'll be much harder to do something like the Clean Power Plan, but I'm sure they are thinking creatively. There will definitely be something there. There's no question vehicles are going to be part of that. They're already working on strengthening the Trump CAFE standards and starting work on medium and heavy duty vehicle standards. There's talk about having a zero emission vehicle requirement like California and a number of states. Certain percentage of sales must be zero emission, whether it's electric, fuel cell, et cetera. So it wouldn't surprise me if that is part of it. And then, yes, a slew of energy efficiency policies and programs, from appliance standards to helping to ramp up building codes to retrofit programs. But those are very high level, and I don't know what those details will be.
So you mentioned electrification. Let's talk about that for a minute. So what we're here in New York, but I hear that a lot of other jurisdictions around the country are looking at electrification, pursuing a lot of policies. What are you seeing as trends on the ground when it comes to electrification?
Certainly in California, you have a growing number of cities that are saying, we don't want you extending gas lines. We want you, when you build something new, to be either all electric or mostly electric. A number of them are exempting, for example, cooking. People really, a lot of people like their gas stoves, and the use is not that much. If you're willing to pay for gas service to have a gas stove, so be it. So that's a general trend. I think programs to incentivize heat pumps and heat pump water heaters are ramping up enormously. California is spending $30-some-odd million on heat pump water heater incentives. New York State, NYSERDA is definitely ramping up its program. So that's another thing. I think there's going to be more work, particularly on new construction, helping to make sure, ultimately codes are going to not allow gas, space, and water heat, because build it right the first time and you can actually save some money by not having to pay for the gas service to help pay for some of these other things. So I think that would be a next step. And I think it's going to vary by climate. It's easy to go all electric if you're in, on the Gulf Coast. It's much harder if you're in Duluth. And, for places like Duluth, I suspect it will be mostly electric, but you will have some type of fuel backup, whether it's natural gas or hydrogen, time will tell. But it's awfully hard to do all electric without creating a really big peak demand problem. For New York, there may be different answers for downstate versus upstate, because the climate is very different.
So what role do you think the federal government will play when it comes to electrification?
I think there's going to be lots of studies coming out of the federal government to help better understand the issues, where electrification makes sense, where it doesn't. There'll be research to try to improve the performance and reduce the cost of heat pump based systems of all sorts of sizes. It wouldn't surprise me if there's some federal tax incentives or other incentives to electrify homes and buildings, and or just to purchase heat pumps and heat pump water heaters.
And you had mentioned ACCC is working on the bill. I was interested in your approach. It's to actually incentivize the manufacturer, which I guess would influence R&D. So from the kind of to seed the pipeline with more efficient equipment that way?
It's very unclear which direction things will go. We are working on 3 proposals, recognizing that the policymakers will decide. One is just improve the existing consumer tax incentives. It's called 25C, but it doesn't get into commercial industrial. And it's more upper middle income, because you have to be able to afford to pay the higher cost and wait for your tax refund. So that's our lowest cost. There are state appliance rebates that were given under the ARA program, 2009-10. We've been talking to some people about reviving that, but really focus on heat pumps and heat pump water heaters of very high efficiency. But then our preferred approach is manufacturer incentives. Give incentives to the manufacturers for their production of high performance heat pumps and heat pump water heaters relative to a baseline period previous. So for incremental improvements, the manufacturer would get rewarded. Or by and large, the manufacturers have the products. They would ramp up production. And as I've talked to some manufacturers, they go, yeah, we might develop some new models combining the high efficiency without quite as many bells and whistles to do it. But the idea is upstream, the manufacturers certainly know how to do it. And if you reduce the cost of the manufacturer, then the wholesale price will be cheaper. You can get less markups, and manufacturers know the market and how to tap into marketing, you know, the way, say, a state energy office is, some do, some don't.
Let's switch gears here a little bit and talk about labor. So surveys are now suggesting that 2/3 of unemployed Americans are considering career changes. I guess that's not so surprising. So, but how do we attract that large pool to the energy efficiency industry? What type of skilled labor do you see needed most for energy efficiency?
Particularly if you were talking unemployed, I would start thinking first about technicians. A lot of the HVAC firms, they are saying they're expecting a lot of retirements. They don't have as many people to fill those jobs. And those would be great jobs to train people. And that's going to require some technical skills. I mean, it's always somewhat technical, but you know, things like computer diagnostics and things like that, you know, a lot of these people will be, you know, more, you know, community college type degrees or the equivalent. So I think that would be a great market. I think there'll be more jobs for engineers and whatnot too, but by and large, those are not going to be the unemployed people, although we need to grow that, expand the industrial assessment center program, expand that into more buildings engineers and not just industrial engineers, things like that. But particularly the technicians, I think that will be a good place. Obviously, you need weatherization workers to caulk and weather strip and insulate. But in particular, if you want good paying jobs, start thinking about technicians.
I'm going to give you a lot of power now in this next question. We can even suspend a little bit of reality if you want, but if I gave you a magic wand right now, Steve, what energy efficiency advancement would you most want to make happen?
I would really focus on retrofitting existing buildings. And I say that because even by 2050, it's still going to be the majority of buildings. And that's the toughest nut to crack. Those are the things that if we're going to truly meet our Paris goals, we have to do existing buildings. Yes, we'll figure out how to do new construction. There are things to do there. But how do we get to existing buildings? And how do we have major programs to assist people to do this, the technical assistance, and where they help to finance it to make that happen.
What do you see as the biggest barrier there?
I think the biggest barrier is probably money. You know, building owners often don't have that money, or they have many different competing interests. And how do we help building retrofits climb up on the list of priorities? You know, that's one of the things I like about building performance standards. It means it climbs up high on the priority. That doesn't mean your job is done, but it means you have their attention. And how do you then help them?
So my last question here, and then we have a lot of audience Q&A, so we'll get to that, is, you know, we have a typical Urban Green audience on the program today. We have a lot of architects, we have a lot of engineers, a lot of building professionals. What's your message to them, Steve? I mean, what's their role over the next 3-4 years?
I think there'll be a lot of increased activity, whether it's coming out of the federal government, the states, the localities, driven by their own interests, as well as additional funding. Hang on to your hats and figure out, you know, as these things, the details start coming out, what is your market niche going to be? How are you going to pursue it? Hopefully there's lots of work for you and maybe work to expand your staff.
All right. Well, let's jump into the Q&A. We've got a lot of it. And I'll remind the audience that you can upvote questions that you want to see at the top of the list. First one is here from Cecil. How likely and useful is a carbon tax, including a bipartisan one being worked on by the Citizens Climate Lobby and others? So carbon tax, how likely, how useful?
I don't see it happening this year. There is discussion, and I think it eventually will happen, whether it's next year or it's going to be several years hence. But there is bipartisan support for it. But getting the 60 votes in the Senate will be challenging. Even 50 votes might be challenging. So it's not going to be immediate. How useful? I think it is useful, but not the only thing we need to do. It is useful because it basically improves the economics of things to reduce greenhouse gases, which is useful, but that's really on the cusp. If you raise the cost of energy by 10, 20%, that's not going to suddenly mean everything flies off the shelf. It just improves the economics a little. The main usefulness of a carbon tax is, or two. One, how do you use the money? In the Northeast, including New York, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, RGGI, spending over half their money in energy efficiency. They've had very positive economic impacts, but it's primarily because they're recycling so much of that money into energy efficiency. They spend it on other things too, but just over half is energy efficiency, and that's really made a difference. I think also, if you have a tax and it's legislated that it will increase steadily, people will factor that into their decisions, and it will affect economics, knowing, well, today it's only 10% of my cost, but that's going to go up. Yes, maybe I will purchase that heat pump chiller. That may be worth it for me. But it's just going to be part, whoever has done the carbon tax, it's had some impact, but not nearly enough to reach the Paris targets. It has to be complemented with other policies and programs. All
right. The next question here, there's a lot of excitement about high-speed rail development. Do you think this is more than a pipe dream? It's an interesting question. I'm seeing it a lot too, and obviously could displace the automobile emissions. So is there a role for high-speed rail here as we get to try to get to net zero?
I think there definitely is for traveling, hundreds of miles as opposed to thousands of miles. It's easier, more comfortable, and could be just as quick. The catch is it tends to be expensive. California's had challenges building their system, and it's not going to be easy, but hey, China's built enormous systems. Europe has expanded their systems enormously. We could do it, but it might take a while. I know when I go from Washington to New York, I'll always take the train. It's just so much easier than flying and having to go out to the airport at each end.
Right. So next question here, how do we align energy efficiency with environmental justice, especially in cities?
We really do need to make sure that as we do energy efficiency, we are serving all customers, and particularly maybe disproportionately serving those who have, are low, moderate income, people of color, because they've been underserved in the past. So I know, I think I can't remember the number in New York State. I think it's either 30 or 40% of all their system benefit charge spending needs to be on, low, moderate income and environmental justice communities. I think we really need to make sure that happens throughout the country, but then not just its spending, but work with community groups in each of those areas on how best to spend that money to really make a difference for those communities. Among other things, you need the community groups because there's a lot of distrust of the utility or other outside players, but you need those community groups to be lead trusted messengers to help reach families and then, help, provide the assistance needed so that they can improve their efficiency. There's also a lot of opportunities for jobs. Unemployment rates tend to be higher in these communities. How do we train people so they can be key job providers? They can get jobs in this area.
Right. Well, speaking of jobs, it leads to the next question by Kristen here is about, can you be more specific on the types of technicians you see coming up in the new labor force?
Good point. I mean, some of it is, residential HVAC technicians. A lot of it is going to be things like commercial controls technicians
Talking about
as
like installers?
installers but also debuggers, people who can do retro commissioning and make sure that they are operating.
Mhm.
How do you deal with, that the damper in zone 3 is stuck open? How do you figure that out? Once it's easy to solve, but figuring out that that's your problem. There's going to be a lot of, sleuth work that's needed and technicians who can do that. Likewise, in industry, increasingly equipment is, computer driven, and you need people to be able to understand that, debug that, and get that equipment functioning properly. So I think if anything, controls is going to be a key area. It's not just, bending metal for ducts. It's really how do these systems and these controls work for optimum performance.
Do you see Department of Labor funding coming down to do that type of job training or job retooling for people?
I think there will be some funding for that. How much is the U.S. Department of Labor? How much is DOE? How much of a lot of it is going to be? Some of this money is going to go to states and cities to do local programs. I expect a lot of it will be, the New York City Department of Labor has some money and they do it as opposed to the U.S. Department of Labor.
Got it.
And some of it will be with like unions, et cetera. Apprenticeships. I'm a strong believer in apprenticeships. It shouldn't just be classroom learning, but get people out into the field and develop with the one technician I know calls a horse sense, for these things.
Keeping on the jobs theme here, the next question is, would a climate job corps be useful? Kind of like a Peace Corps equivalent, but a climate job corps. Have you heard people speaking of, kind of motivating programs like that?
I've heard of it. I think it potentially could be useful. However, these types of job corps are only useful to the extent there are jobs at the other end. And so my tendency is more for more local programs that work with the employers to give the training and have something so that if they do well, there's a good chance they will have a job at the end, as opposed to some national program. And yeah, you have a little experience, but you don't really know any of the local employers because, and you may not. So I'm not saying no. I'm not sure it's a top priority.
Yep. Here's the next question on financing, and you had mentioned earlier. So what do you view as the most promising avenues for financing energy efficiency? What are the biggest needs, sources, models, strategies?
I think we need creative financing that's easy for people to use. I like on-bill finance because you have the credit history, you have an easy way to pay it. And yes, there needs to be ways to work with the utilities to help spread the risk. And utilities are not banks, but I see that as promising. I see PACE as promising, but creative financing, I think, will be very important. There is, proposals for a national green bank, and they in turn could help fund more local efforts, but ultimately it comes down to the local. It's not you're going to borrow money from the National Green Bank. They, just like New York State, the Green Bank effectively helps fund provides capital in a variety of ways. Comes down to the individual, finance vehicles that can be offered as a result.
And of course, we have commercial PACE in New York that just passed with our building performance climate standards. And so that's just ramping up now with a lot of interest. Next question here. Good question. What's the best way to frame climate policy politically? Are there certain subjects that are seen as more bipartisan?
Yes, international competitiveness is an important one. We need to do the best job we can so we are competitive in these international markets. It will serve us, but we can sell overseas. It's creating jobs. That's going to be another critical path. It's improving health to the extent we can show documented health impacts, but tie it to things that people, regardless of party, care about, jobs and health, and not just to, oh, it's good for the polar bears.
Got it. So next question here is, district heating systems offer significant efficiencies in dense areas. And there are now heat exchange systems that can be integrated into drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater streams. Is anyone looking to achieve efficiencies such that when new water infrastructure is installed, district heating exchange systems are also considered?
I think it's coming up on occasional on a one-off basis, but I don't think there's any systematic effort that I'm aware of, at least. Maybe your questioner knows, and it's a leading question. I'd be curious if I suspect they know more than I do on this particular topic.
Next question here from Donna. There's a concern that people are buying cars as a side effect of COVID. It's interesting. I just read an article on that this weekend, that people are looking to get out, and so they're buying cars, more cars. Would there be measures to support the recovery and growth of public transportation, maybe even in the infrastructure type bill that we see coming?
There certainly was some money in the bill that has already passed to help transit agencies, but I think that's going to be more help their finances, but also help to improve ventilation and other things that will help to lure people back. I expect there will be a transportation bill, maybe part of the broader Build Back Better infrastructure, maybe separate, and it definitely will have a large public transit component to it. Exactly what makes it in versus not, I don't know. The House last year passed a bill with quite a few provisions on that. The Senate was much more precipitous about what they would do for public transit. Time will tell where that meeting point is between those two positions.
There's a question from Sarah. Does the GSA benchmark energy use in buildings, and do they have plans for large building stock to get to net zero?
I think they generally do have some benchmarking. Yes, they've done a variety of net zero projects. I don't think they have systematic plans. Certainly for the last 4 years, they were not encouraged to do so. But hopefully in the coming years, there will be much more of a incentive and pressure on them to maybe not get to net zero, but at least to start thinking about deep retrofits and getting as far as they can.
Question from Irene: as we decarbonize our buildings and stop using gas for heating and utilities, the oil and gas industries are at risk for large amounts of stranded assets. What can be done to mitigate this, and who should pay for it?
Okay, I mean, the oil companies, they see the writing on the wall to some extent. They're starting to transition, varying from company to company. Some, so I'm not too worried about the majors, if you will. For gas utilities, though, as in natural gas, yes, they have these investments that they've made. They're expecting at least another 30 years of life. I think we're going to have to help them depreciate those on an accelerated basis. Securitization is often mentioned, but it's not just, screw your shareholders. No, if we as a society decides that electrification makes sense, then we as a society are going to have to figure out how to help pay for it. So not that they get rich, but so they are whole. Question
about FEMA. What role can they play to help homes and trailers that they provide get to net zero?
I mean, FEMA should very much pay attention to energy efficiency, both in the temporary, the homes and trailers, particularly the more permanent homes as opposed to temporary trailers, but also in rebuilding, helping people to rebuild in an efficient way rather than just to we only pay to rebuild to the inefficient way the building was before. And there's some changes to the law that are helping that, but we need to keep moving in that direction. in terms of actual, modular homes, Efficiency Vermont and also in Delaware, they're building effectively net zero modular mobile homes. And we should be looking at making that much, much more common.
Next question here from Sarah. If we went all electric, what would the grid be able to handle the energy we need? Or do we need building efficiency as well to reach the carbon neutral grid?
Efficiency is going to be essential. It's going to be very hard and very expensive to build enough generation so that during a polar vortex, we can be heating all these inefficient buildings. We need to really drive the loads down through energy efficiency. We need cold climate heat pumps to, maximize efficiency on those cold days. And frankly, in cold climates, we're going to need, I think, some type of backup system. It may be propane, for example, for those that 1 week every third year, so that you don't have to build power plants just to serve that 1 week every third year when a polar vortex comes along.
What do you see as the federal government's role to jumpstart the renewable industry for example, offshore wind?
The offshore wind industry seems to be doing pretty well to me. Yes, that includes federal tax incentives, and we need to keep those coming. But a lot of states, whether it's New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Jersey, are doing a lot to further that, and we should encourage that to continue. So I don't, obviously we have this first plant off of Cape Cod that's starting to get its approvals. We need to start putting more projects. I was about to say in the water, but in the ground, but in the water. And learn from it and improve that. But I think we're on a good path. But yes, federal incentives will be part of that, as well as all these state efforts.
Next question here brings me back to my former career in working with you, Steve. It says, how concerned are you about refrigerant leakage as we deploy heat pumps at scale?
We need good technicians that can install systems so that they are lower leaks. You're never going to 100% eliminate leaks. That said, we need refrigerants that are much safer to the environment than the old refrigerants. But we're in the process of tightening things down under the Kigali Agreement and associated federal laws. That's a great step. I suspect there'll be one more round of further tightening, but we don't have to get to zero, but we have to get it quite low, but then minimize the leaks through quality installation.
Next question from Elizabeth. Can you talk about how energy efficiency can scale up to the levels needed? Is this through utilities programs, or are there promising business models for energy efficiency companies, aggregators, et cetera? So how do we scale?
We're going to need multiple ways to scale. It's not just one. Yes, it's utility programs. Yes, it's state and maybe even local programs, particularly in some of the environmental justice communities we were talking about earlier. Yes, there is improved business models, whether it's we're talking about CPACE before, or various on-bill things. There's a company primarily active in the Hudson Valley called SEAL that's doing energy as a service financing. There's a company called Dandelion that's figuring out how to install ground source heat pumps and making it economics pay. Now, these last two, they work reasonably well in upper middle class houses. They require a certain size and energy use. So we need to develop other creative models that work at all sizes and income levels, and not just the upper middle class. But it's going to be a combination of all sorts of programs, as well as creative entrepreneurs who come up with better ways to build an efficiency mousetrap.
So, here's a good question. I'm glad this was asked. Do you see embodied carbon being integrated into codes or building design standards?
Yes, but gradually. We first need, and we're starting to do some looking at that. We first need to identify what are the key metrics, what are the key data. It's first going to start with very progressive owners saying, I want my building to minimize embodied carbon, whether it's the city of Berkeley or, pick your favorite, foundation or environmental products company. But based on that, we're going to learn a lot. And then gradually, I think there will be some type of building code requirements. But I don't see a lot of that for a while. As I mentioned before, we're trying to get to at least zero energy readying codes by 2030. I see getting embodied energy widespread into codes would be after that. So call it the 2030s. It starts to phase in as opposed to next year.
Question back to large renewables here. One of the big barriers is the siting process for those. So the question here is, how can the federal government improve the permitting process for large renewables?
I'm not an expert on federal permitting, but there are a lot of steps. Can you do them more in parallel? Could you combine steps? Can you do things not to reduce the protections, but to do it more time efficiently, particularly things to go in parallel rather than in series?
Okay. Next question from Kristen. Are there progressive banks lending to projects that are well built? So question here is which banks are doing this? So are you aware of banks that are helping to do the type of green financing that we talked about earlier?
There are a few, sometimes, with pilot projects, sometimes, even the big money-centered banks often have some funds that they reserve for projects. Like I remember Bank of America is doing a project with Community Development Finance, CDFAs, administrations, I guess. CDFA banks in general are often a place that are innovating more, but there are like 3,000 of them. I'm not saying they all are, but, and I don't remember the names of individual ones these days, I knew some in a few years ago, but I'm not current on, oh yeah, go to XYZ Bank.
There's a question from Sarah. What do you see as the future for nuclear?
Good question. I think existing nuclear plants, particularly those in plants with 2 or more units, they'll try to extend their life. Individual plants, the economics tend to be tough, as in one on a site. And you're going to have more of them retired, as well as if they just didn't build them in a place that made sense. Indian Point, 27 miles from Times Square, might not be the best place for a nuclear plant. But there will be a lot of research on smaller modular reactors. If they can come in at a cost-effective price, I do see some of them being built. It's very unclear whether they can truly come in at a price. Over the years, I've seen too many times that people said, oh yeah, we'll get the cost down, and they haven't yet. Because you can only get the cost down while retaining safety, not sacrificing safety. So we'll try. Whether we succeed, unclear.
It only took 55 minutes to drop the nuclear question on you, Steve. One more question, this will probably be our last, from Ellen. So she read your blog a few weeks ago about changes in the development process for the IECC. She wants to know your opinion about that process and what we should be watching in future revisions.
I think we were and are concerned that the change to the process will not help to advance codes the way they need to in order to decarbonize.
And maybe you can explain the changes, because they're pretty big for the audience.
Right. So as I mentioned before, we moved from a code officials oriented process where the code officials voted on proposals. And now that we have many of them who care about climate, they actually enacted a lot of things over opposition from home builders. The new process will be a committee And it's supposed to have, I think anything has to have 2/3 vote. A lot of it is going to be who's on the committee and can you get anything done with that 2/3 vote or not. So they're accepting nominations now. I'd encourage your members to think about applying. We need to get good people on those committees so that something happens. I mean, I think frankly, there's also discussion about if the IEC process doesn't work going forward, do we need to move the lead on codes to some other organization? For example, ASHRAE has 90.2, and does that become the lead? For those with a long memory, originally 90.2 was the important one, or 90, it was before it got separated into 90.1 and 90.2. It didn't move as much, so the IECC started doing more, and people switched their allegiance to the IECC. But I can go back if the IECC process doesn't work.
All right. Well, let's leave it there. I want to thank my guest, Steve Nadel, for a really, really informative session. Thanks for spending time with Urban Green today, Steve. It was a great discussion.
Yep, I enjoyed it, and good luck to all of your work.
So if you like today's program, it's a great example of what we do at Urban Green. We take on the biggest challenges with the biggest solutions to have the biggest impact. If you're new to us, check us out. We do all that in 4 key ways. We convene, we research, we advocate, and we educate. We'd love for you to join us as we do that. Steve, stay safe, stay well. And I want to say to everybody out there, thank you, and we'll see you at our next program.
Hey, thank you.